There are television moments that age like fine wine, scenes that become funnier, more beloved, and more meaningful the further we get from them. And then there are moments so electric, so perfectly timed that they feel less like television and more like someone bottled a lightning strike and put it on a network schedule. For millions of fans of Laverne Shirley, those moments almost always arrive the same way: a door swinging open, two men materializing from nowhere, and a single syllable, "Hello!" detonating like a comedic bomb in the middle of whatever drama or romance had just been building. Lenny Squiggy and Andrew Squiggy Squigman were not supposed to be legends. They were written as recurring comic relief, the kind of side characters who serve the plot, get a few laughs, and fade into the background while the real story moves on. That was the plan, anyway. What actually happened was something none of the producers, writers, or network executives could have fully scripted. David Lander and Michael McKean took those roles and transformed them into something that would outlast the show itself, outlast the era, and continue influencing sitcom comedy decades after the final episode aired. But here's the thing that most people who love the show have never fully heard: what Cindy Williams and Penny Marshall actually thought about all of it. Not the polished soundbites from promotional interviews, not the careful, cheerful reminiscing at reunion panels. The real story, the private observations, the behind-the-scenes tension and laughter, the complicated admiration that took years to come out in full. And when it finally did, it painted a picture of a show that was simultaneously a joy and a battlefield, a workplace full of genius that sometimes made everyone feel like they were barely holding on. Penny Marshall grew up in the Bronx with comedy in her bloodstream. Her brother Gary Marshall was already carving out a reputation in Hollywood as a writer and producer. Penny followed a path that was partly opportunity and partly undeniable talent. By the time Laverne and Shirley began in 1976 as a spin-off of Happy Days, Penny had already demonstrated on The Odd Couple that she understood comic timing at a molecular level. She knew how a pause worked. She knew what silence could do to an audience. She knew, perhaps better than anyone on that set, that comedy is architecture. Cindy Williams brought a different energy. She had serious dramatic credentials. A role in American Graffiti alongside a rising generation of Hollywood talent had given her real film cachet. When she came to Laverne Shirley, she was not simply a comedian stepping into a sitcom. She was an actress who had made a deliberate choice to explore a genre she genuinely loved. She brought a warmth and a groundedness to Shirley Feeney that kept the character from ever becoming a caricature. Shirley was earnest, sometimes naive, occasionally preachy. Cindy made every single one of those qualities endearing rather than irritating. Together, the two women built a chemistry that became the spine of the show. Their friendship on screen felt real because in many ways it was. They bickered, they laughed, they protected each other through the long hours of production. And when Lenny and Squiggy arrived to upend everything, it was their shared anchor that kept the show from simply becoming a carnival. Penny spoke over the years about the night she first encountered David Lander and Michael McKean doing what would eventually become Lenny and Squiggy. It was not an audition in any formal sense. It was a casual social gathering, the kind of event that creative people in Los Angeles have always used as a proving ground without ever quite admitting that's what it is. Lander and McKean, already known within comedy circles for their work with the sketch and satire group, The Credibility Gap, were among the guests. At some point during the evening, they simply became their characters, slipping into voices, postures, rhythms, and an almost terrifying chemistry that filled the room with laughter before anyone had consciously decided to watch them. What Penny understood immediately, and what she described in various interviews with a kind of affectionate disbelief, was that the two men were not performing for an audience. They were performing because they could not stop themselves. The characters existed in them the way certain songs exist in certain musicians. Not as something learned, but as something lived. The accents, the physical posture, the slightly off-kilter relationship with basic social norms. All of it was already fully formed, already breathing. She brought them to Gary. And Gary, who had spent years thinking about comedy in terms of contrast and structure and what he sometimes called the social ladder of a good sitcom, saw exactly what Penny saw and filed it immediately into his understanding of what Laverne and Shirley still needed. The show had heart. It had two extraordinary lead actresses. What it lacked was the particular kind of comic disruption that makes an audience exhale with relief, the reminder that no matter how hard life gets, there are always people out there who make your problems look manageable by comparison. Cindy Williams was more measured than Penny in discussing what Lenny and Squiggy meant to the show. Not because she loved them less, but because her perspective was shaped by a different experience. While Penny, as Gary's sister, had a certain insider comfort on the set, Cindy operated from the position of a working actress who had made a significant professional commitment to a long-running television series. She was invested. She cared that deeply about the integrity of the show, and about what Laverne Shirley represented, two women surviving and thriving on their own terms, in an era when that was not yet a television cliché. What she said in scattered interviews and retrospective pieces over the years amounted to a quiet but genuine acknowledgement of just how good Lander and McKean were. She described watching them work as both a pleasure and a professional challenge. A pleasure because their talent was undeniable and infectious. A challenge because the discipline required to not simply dissolve into laughter every time they entered a scene was genuinely exhausting. There is a physical toll to suppressing laughter for hours at a time on a hot soundstage. Cindy joked about it, but there was something real underneath the humor. The sense that working alongside performers of that caliber demanded a level of control that went beyond normal professionalism. She was also candid about the way the show's dynamic could occasionally feel uneven. When Lenny and Squiggy walked into a scene, the audience responded with an immediacy and a volume that was different from what even the lead characters reliably produced. That is not a comfortable thing to sit with. Even for performers as secure and talented as Cindy and Penny, it did not create lasting resentment. The record of their affection for Lander and McKean, and specifically McKean's publicly expressed love for Lander following his death in 2020, makes that clear. But it created a complexity that neither woman bothered to fully address in public for many years. The mechanics of how Lenny and Squiggy were used in the show reveal a great deal about Gary Marshall's thinking. He was famously precise about timing, the kind of producer who understood that the placement of a joke within an episode structure was as important as the joke itself. He knew watching Lander and McKean that he had something rare, a comedy delivery system that worked almost independently of context. They could walk into any scene at almost any emotional register, and within 30 seconds, the audience would be somewhere entirely different. That kind of versatility is almost impossible to manufacture. It either exists or it doesn't. What Gary did was treated as a structural element. Lenny and Squiggy became the show's pressure valve, deployed at specific moments to release tension that might otherwise have made an episode feel too heavy, or to reset an audience's emotional state before the next significant story beat. This is something Penny discussed with what sounded like genuine admiration for her brother's instincts. The characters were not random. Their appearances were calibrated, even when they felt spontaneous. And that calibration was only possible because Gary trusted Lander and McKean enough to give them room while also shaping the frame around them. Cindy's perspective on this is interesting, because it speaks to her experience as the actress responsible for maintaining Shirley's emotional continuity across episodes that kept being interrupted by comedic hurricanes. She described the challenge of re-entering herself after a Lenny and Squiggy scene, of returning to the emotional truth of a moment that had just been gleefully detonated. It required a kind of internal reset that she eventually became very good at, but never found easy. That is the other side of the comedy ladder that Gary was so proud of. The people on the upper rungs had to be strong enough to survive the chaos below them and still be standing when the scene needed them. In 2026, the world is remembering Laverne and Shirley in a way that gives new weight to everything Cindy and Penny observed. January marked the 50th anniversary of the show's premiere, and the celebrations have been widespread. In Milwaukee, the city that served as the show's fictional home, Lakefront Brewery has spent the year leaning fully into the nostalgia. Every brewery tour for the last 2 decades has ended the same way, with guests singing the Laverne Shirley theme song, raising their fists in the air at "Do It Our Way." Russ Klisch, the brewery's president, notes that the moment hits especially hard for women in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, who remember what it meant to see working women on television doing jobs that weren't always welcoming to them. That legacy of two women making it on their own terms has only grown more significant with time. As the CBS 58 report on the anniversary noted, Laverne and Shirley showed us what it looks like to chase big dreams 50 years later. Their message is still inspiring women to do it their way. The anniversary has also brought new attention to the show's extended creative family. In March 2026, the Gary Marshall Theater in Burbank presented Earth to Squiggy, Lenny and the Squigtones musical, a production that brought the characters back to the stage with a deeply personal connection. The musical was conceived by Natalie Lander, daughter of David L. Lander, who played Squiggy. It featured songs originally written by Lander and Michael McKean for their 1979 comedy rock album, recorded live at the Roxy in Hollywood. The production, which returned after a sold-out run in 2025, stands as a living tribute to the creative partnership that began at a party in Penny Marshall's living room nearly 50 years earlier. Both women touched on something that is less often discussed in the mythology of the show: the quality of the writing that supported Lenny and Squiggy. It is easy in retrospect to attribute everything to performance to Lander's twitchy, electric unpredictability, and McKean's loose, deliberate timing and performance was central. But the writers who built the scaffolding for those characters, who found ways to integrate them into stories without simply using them as interrupters, deserve credit that is rarely given. Penny, who developed a sophisticated understanding of how Laverne Shirley worked from both sides of the camera, acknowledged this. The characters had internal logic. They had desires, modest, often absurd desires, but real ones. That is what separated them from pure comic props. Cindy spoke about this in the context of what she believes made the show hold up over time. Comedy that relies entirely on surface-level goofiness ages quickly. What gave Lenny and Squiggy their staying power was the suggestion, always present beneath the jokes and the leather jackets and the catastrophic social instincts, that these were men with feelings. They wanted things. They failed. They kept showing up anyway. That is, she noted, not so different from what Laverne and Shirley were doing, which is perhaps why the four characters worked so well together, and why the show felt like an actual community rather than a collection of comic types. The years since Laverne Shirley ended have given both women a different relationship with its legacy. Penny Marshall went on to a directing career that included significant commercial and critical successes. Big, A League of Their Own, Awakenings, and developed a public persona that was warm, self-deprecating, and genuinely funny in interviews. She talked about the show and her castmates with an ease that suggested real affection unencumbered by bitterness, even as accounts of production difficulties and contractual tensions occasionally surfaced in entertainment journalism. She passed away in 2018, leaving behind a career and a life that her friends and collaborators consistently describe in terms of the same qualities she brought to Laverne DeFazio: an absolute, uncomplicated commitment to doing the thing honestly. Cindy Williams was more private in her later years, but the interviews and reflections she gave about Laverne and Shirley shared a consistent thread: gratitude for having been part of something that mattered to people. She spoke about meeting fans decades after the show ended, and hearing how much the friendship between Laverne and Shirley meant to them, how it modeled something about loyalty and support that felt genuinely useful to real women navigating real lives. That is a legacy that goes beyond entertainment, and Cindy held it with appropriate seriousness. Her death in January 2023, at the age of 75, brought a new wave of reflection on the show's enduring place in American culture. Her children, Zach and Emily Hudson, released a statement that captured what so many felt. The passing of our kind, hilarious mother, Cindy Williams, has brought us insurmountable sadness that could never truly be expressed. She was one of a kind, beautiful, generous, and possessed a brilliant sense of humor and a glittering spirit that everyone loved. What both women's retrospective accounts share, when it comes specifically to Lenny and Squiggy, is a kind of wonder. Not the easy nostalgia of people remembering something fondly because time has smoothed out the difficulties, but genuine wonder at having been in the room, on the stage, in the frame when something that special was happening. The recognition that talent of that particular kind is extraordinarily rare, and that they were lucky enough to collide with it daily for years. David Lander was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, not long after Laverne and Shirley ended. He kept it private for years, managing the disease while continuing to work, eventually becoming a public advocate for mis-awareness and research. He wrote about his experience with characteristic honesty in his memoir. His willingness to speak openly about living with a serious illness gave him a different kind of visibility later in life. When he died in December 2020, the tributes that came from his colleagues were full of specific, detailed love. Not the generic warmth of professional courtesy, but the real grief of people who had genuinely known him. Michael McKean's tribute was the one that most people remember. 51 years of friendship, he said. 51 years. That number alone tells a story about what Lenny and Squiggy were beneath the performance, a connection between two people that was real and durable in a business where very little is either. Penny Marshall, by the time of Lander's death, was already gone. But her feelings about both men had been on record for years in the warmth with which she described that first night in her living room, in the obvious pleasure she took in talking about working with them, in the simple fact that she had brought them to her brother in the first place. She gave them the room. She trusted what she saw. That is its own form of legacy. What Cindy Williams and Penny Marshall ultimately broke silence on through years of interviews, memoirs, retrospectives, and the occasional late-night television appearance was not a scandal or a secret. It was something more fundamental, the truth of what it actually felt like to be inside a piece of television history while it was being made, the exhaustion of not laughing, the discipline of holding the frame, the strange mix of professional competition and genuine admiration that comes with sharing a stage with performers who are genuinely extraordinary. They confirmed what the audience always suspected, that Lenny and Squiggy were not just funny, but were funny in a way that made everything around them funnier, including the characters trying desperately to maintain composure against them. That the show worked because everyone knew their role, and two of those roles happened to be the controlled center, and two others happened to be the magnificent chaos, and that the whole thing from the living room to the soundstage to the memory, 50 years later, was rarer than anyone involved quite knew how to say. Some television shows last because they are carefully constructed, some last because they catch something real at exactly the right moment. Laverne and Shirley was both, and at the heart of why it remains worth talking about, worth revisiting, worth writing about, stand four people who understood comedy well enough to let it breathe and trusted each other enough to share the room. That is the story Cindy and Penny finally told in full, and it is, as it turns out, exactly as good as the show.